Donald Trump has been sworn in as the 47th President of the United States, and in his inauguration speech, he shared some of his plans for the next 4 years with a pledge to, quote, put America first. With more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective. It's January 21st here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Now today we speak with a panel of American press about President Donald Trump's first day in office. For this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with the Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me back.
I also have Christian Datoc with Washington Examiner joining this session virtually from Washington D.C. Christian, thank you so much for being with us at this very early hour to end. It's like 3:30 in the morning on Tuesday there.
It is very early, but it's an honor to be back here with you guys. Thank you again.
Right. Christian, then let's begin with details of President Trump's inauguration speech. So what was the gist of his first address as the 47th President of the U.S.?
On the one hand, President Trump outlined what he called a golden age for America. But once you got deeper into the speech, this really became a victory lap directly in the face of former President Joe Biden, former President Bill Clinton, and former President Barack Obama. It was a strict and tight speech when it comes to Trump standards. He did not necessarily ramble and go off topic like he did at some of his appearances later in the day and evening. But again, it gave the American public, the media, a true sense of what Trump is going to pursue. He wants to lock down the southern border here in the United States, stem the flow of northern migration. He wants to essentially roll back all of Joe Biden's signature accomplishments in office, and he wants to reset the U.S. Common sense norms, as he called them. All in all, it wasn't necessarily as divisive or chaotic as Trump's first inauguration speech was, but to opponents of the president, it certainly cast some clouds in the sky and gave a number of warning signs of the days and weeks to come.
Right. And Kelly, before we turn to Christian for the latest in Washington, D.C., what are some of your takeaways from the president's inauguration speech?
Yeah, so I was looking at his speech and his actions in the hours after, more from a foreign policy perspective. I think one interesting point that he hit on that he has repeatedly said throughout his campaign is that he wants to put America first, whatever that may mean. There's a lot of vague language in these kinds of speeches. He also mentioned some kind of restoration of American sovereignty. What I gathered from that is that, the United States might take on kind of a harder policy in terms of trade. That's something that he's threatened to do even today. He said he was going to enact a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico starting February 1st. In the Middle East, and this was not during the speech, but after, Trump signed some orders basically reversing executive orders from the Biden administration, including one from February that sanctioned Israeli settlers and groups that were accused of being violent in the West Bank and of disrupting order. So that seems like a fairly non-controversial order for an administration that has largely been pro-Israel in many ways, and here Trump is kind of undoing it. And so all these are indications that at least within the Middle East there might be a strong policy supporting Israel's side of the war. Marco Rubio is very close to becoming Secretary of State and has expressed that as well. But the speech itself was very centered on the United States for a U.S. audience, and I think that's some kind of indication here in Korea of maybe this part of the world not being the primary focus in January and February.
Right. Christian, also, what has been the response to the president's speech there in D.C.?
The response has been mixed, to say the least, and I'll get into that in a second, but I do want to bring up a point that Kelly made, and I think it's an important one to hammer home on. Donald Trump, from the beginning of his political career, has talked about being, quote unquote, America first. That being said, I do think he is going to be placing a strong emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, specifically in terms of helping U.S. allies manage potentially growing tensions with China. We can talk about the TikTok executive order later on, or potential tariffs that he has for China. But as far as the reaction to this speech, again, I think opponents of the president didn't necessarily see anything in there to make them say, okay, Donald Trump, he did his first term in office. He was indicted dozens of times while running his second campaign, but we're looking to him to be a unifier now. I think there wasn't much in that speech for those people to hang their hats on. That being said, if you are a Trump supporter, this is exactly what you wanted to hear. You wanted to see Donald Trump come out and say, we're going to lower prices, we're going to address inflation, even if it's, sort of nonsense rhetoric, and there are months and weeks and new administrative policies that need to go into place, let alone this legislative package that Republicans can't figure out a vehicle to advance. He's focusing on the border. He's going to declare, he has already declared a national emergency, and they will move forward with some of those deportation proceedings. This is what you wanted to hear if you voted for Donald Trump. It's more of the same from the first term in office. And again, if you're an opponent or a critic, that's nothing that you can be necessarily happy with.
Right. Christian, prior to the inauguration, media reports spoke about over 200 executive actions to be signed by the president on Monday. And there were quite a number of pundits who were very quick to point out that these are different from executive orders, of which President Trump also reportedly signed dozens. First of all, Christian, could you tell us a bit more about the discrepancy between executive actions and executive orders, and what are some of the major executive initiatives, I'm going to say, that is called for on this Monday?
Certainly. Well, in layman's terms, the difference between an executive order versus an executive action is that the former is much more binding and legally sound than the latter. It has to be published in the Federal Register, and it directs specific government organizations how to operate and make changes. An executive action could be something trivial. Like in Donald Trump's inauguration speech, he said the new policy of the United States is that there are only two genders, male and female. That doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't change anything on a base level, as opposed to these executive orders that rolled back the Biden administration's immigration policies or green energy and electric vehicle policies. Those are no longer on the books, nor are they the law of the land in the United States. I think when you look at the most important orders that the president signed on Monday, the majority of them do have to do with immigration, with closing down the border, which, again, he campaigned on not only this year, but in 2020 as well, and in 2016, his first victorious White House bid. We're going to see more of these executive initiatives, like you coined them, Sunhee, in the coming days and weeks. And again, the idea that President Trump would sign 200 executive orders on his first day in office proved to be a little bragging, perhaps, by some of these Trump officials. He did sign dozens of orders. He did sign a number of them that, again, sort of installed personnel at the cabinet and sub-cabinet level. But ultimately, a lot of this is symbolic. It's gesturing to his base what his priorities will be. There needs to be more time for the Trump administration to get their legs under them before we can see substantive policy change in areas all across American politics.
Right, for sure. Kelly, on the diplomatic front, of course, it's clear that Mr. Trump's priority is probably ending the war between Ukraine and Russia. But his nominees, including that of Secretary of State Marco Rubio that you mentioned earlier, they've underscored the threat posed by North Korea. In fact, Mr. Rubio claimed Kim Jong-un views nuclear weapons as his insurance policy, and that no amount of sanctions, therefore, would deter Kim from developing nuclear weapons. Do you suppose under Trump we may be looking ahead to a different approach to engaging with North Korea?
Yeah, that's really hard to say. I've seen all sorts of changes happen under Trump the last time that he was president, really breaking from some of the more traditionalist policies of Obama and then, as we saw later, with Biden. But at the same time, what Marco Rubio just said there isn't necessarily a big break from what Democratic Party presidents may have said about North Korea in the past. North Korea is a chronic question for every administration, and North Korea has a tendency to ratchet up tensions when there's a new president, but the solution hasn't been that different at the end of the day. It is absolutely true that Kim Jong-un sees nuclear weapons as a way to have an insurance policy on power, and that's probably not going to change. Biden and Obama tended to be very pro-sanctions, and it is also true that even a very harsh sanctions policy hasn't necessarily changed the way that North Korea operates, although we did have a blip of re-engagement in those summits back around 2018. So those views are not too, I would say, revolutionary or breaking from what we see now. Rubio has also said that he wants to work with South Korea and Japan on the North Korea question, but in a way that doesn't encourage other nations to take up nuclear arms. Again, not a very surprising take. But at the same time, Trump has really been a wild card when dealing with North Korea. His choice to engage with the North in 2018 with multiple summits was very controversial at the time. It remains controversial in history. Some people see it as a successful effort at taking a different approach that we haven't seen since the Sunshine Policy era. Other people see it as fruitless labor in the end. It really just depends on how you look at it, and it's also a very politically divisive question in general. So we'll just have to see. I think North Korea is probably not at the top of his foreign policy objectives right now, but North Korea might change the way it behaves in the coming months.
Right. Staying with North Korea, Christian, Mr. Trump's nominee for defense, Pete Hegseth, during his confirmation hearing, called North Korea a nuclear power, prompting much backlash from South Korea. Based on your coverage on the ground there in Washington, D.C., should we be concerned about a potential shift in U.S. policy with regard to North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons?
Look, Pete Hegseth is a U.S. veteran. He is one of the more hawkish members of Donald Trump's incoming cabinet, or at least cabinet nominees. And I don't think this should be viewed as necessarily a substantive shift in U.S. policy. I think Pete Hegseth, what he was saying, at least in my conversations with Trump aides, is that we have to treat North Korea as a nuclear power because they are continuing to pursue nuclear weapons. And we have very strong allies in the region who obviously would bear the brunt of any attack by North Korea before those missiles could reach U.S. shores. So when it comes to protecting our allies in the region, I do think, given North Korea's involvement in the Ukraine-Russian war and the potential for technology sharing there, the U.S. will take a more active stance in terms of preventing nuclear weapons proliferation in North Korea. But ultimately, I do believe Kelly is right. North Korea is not at the top of President Trump's list of foreign policy objectives. That being said, we did see how he sort of pursued a peaceful route as opposed to his predecessors here in the United States with North Korea during his first term in office. And like Kelly said, Trump is a wild card. I think it's a little too early to sort of prescribe what his foreign policies will be. We're getting hints and glimmers here and there, but ultimately, when Trump is talking about seizing the Panama Canal, making Canada the 51st state here in the United States, I think a lot of this is posturing. We have to wait and see until the dust settles what he is really serious about.
Right. And before I pursue on with that question, Christian, I'd first like to ask Kelly a little bit about domestic affairs here in the country. Kelly, based on your coverage here in South Korea, how do you respond to concerns that given the situation here in Seoul, the country may be incapable of perhaps, or a little bit might be difficult for the country to better deal with diplomatic and security related issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of smart people working the South Korean government still who are poised to deal with these issues and have been tracking the kind of rhetoric that is coming from Trump on the campaign trail about some of the changes that he's been threatening to enact in the U.S.-Korea relationship. At the same time, this political turmoil is really dragging out at this point. When President Yoon declared martial law and then it was swatted down hours later by members of the National Assembly, I think there was this initial feeling that it's kind of over and we can move on. But now we're seeing that, there's been a struggle to detain him, a struggle to get him to cooperate with questioning. He's being formally charged. There's, a trial and proceedings to happen from there. South Korea has already changed acting presidents once. And of course, right now in the Middle East, every single day, we're dealing with a very sensitive situation from the United States perspective. So South Korea doesn't exactly look like it's poised on the best footing to deal with any kind of radical changes to the U.S.-Korea relationship. With that said, South Korea may not be at the forefront of Trump's to-do list, but it's certainly concerning. And then there's always the concern that, other nations may not want to deal with growing specific initiatives with Korea until its leadership situation has stabilized. We don't necessarily have a power vacuum here anymore, but it doesn't come off like who's in power now is going to be the person that President Trump is dealing with 6 months from now, let alone these other nations that engage with South Korea on a diplomatic basis every day. So to answer that question, I think it's a really legitimate domestic concern here within politics.
Right. And back in Washington, Christian, now, as you were saying, Mr. Trump has proposed buying Greenland from Denmark, taking the Panama Canal from Panama and merging Canada, like you said, with the U.S. as its 51st state. What has been the response to these remarks by Mr. Trump that in the U.S., and what are the prospects of these realities, do you think?
Well, I don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but I think the reaction has been mixed, to be quite frank. Some people view this as Trump's ridiculousness rearing its head again. Some people look at this and say, okay, Donald Trump is trying to redraw battle lines in the West when it comes to our relationships with our allies, our most two important trade partners, in North America, Canada and Mexico. And the Panama Canal piece, I do think, is a little ribbing at Xi Jinping. There is no evidence that China is operating the Panama Canal, but Donald Trump continues to insist that they are. And again, when it comes to his public statements, he is more prone to float these sort of trial balloons out there, see how the public or other foreign dignitaries might react, and then amend his policy based on those reactions. But I do think there is a nugget of truth when it comes to his pursuit of Greenland. Let's not forget, Donald Trump tried to purchase Greenland back during his first term in office, and that process actually advanced beyond a point that people thought the negotiations would get to. Obviously, Denmark brushed Donald Trump off at the time, but now it seems like they're coming back to the table and they might be willing to make some type of deal. I think the reason Donald Trump is pursuing Greenland is because, one, it is of a vital national security standpoint when it comes to protecting the United States from a naval attack across the Polar Sea, whether that be from China or Russia. And I do think the wealth of natural resources that have truly been untapped there's only about 60,000 people there not making great use of the rare earth minerals and the metals and the oil and natural gas that Greenland is rich with. That looks like a big-time payday for Donald Trump. He's always about making a deal and getting one over on the other guy. This seems to be an area where I do think he will continue to pursue a purchase. And again, it's one that I think probably has more credibility than his other threats regarding the Panama Canal or Canada.
Right, I see. All right, Christian, thank you so much for your time and thoughts today. Do get some sleep. Thank you very much. And here in the studio, Kelly, thank you so much for your insights as well.
Thank you.
Right, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching, and do join us again same time tomorrow for more.